Dealings with the Dead, number 85. The chains of Stephen Byrne were stricken off, and Jesse was liberated from prison. They were men of note. If there were not giants, there were lions in those days. Colvin soon became weary of standing upon that dizzy eminence where circumstances had placed him. He had a painful recollection, no doubt, more or less distinct of the past, and after he had served the high purpose for which he had been brought from New Jersey, he expressed an earnest wish to return to the home of his adoption, where he had found in the good Mr. Polhamus a friend who had considered the necessities and distresses of his body and mind, and who had been willing, in return for his feeble services, to give him shelter and protection. The Byrnes had undoubtedly a fortunate and almost a miraculous escape. So had their honors, the judges, Chase and Doolittle. Their first meeting after the denouement must have been perfectly tragicomical. Their escape from an awful precipice may admonish all who sit in judgment upon the lives of their fellow men to administer the law with extreme caution, and with a high and holy regard for those well-established principles and rules which can never be disregarded with impunity. God forbid that any humble phraseology of mine should for an instant be perverted to mislead the meanest understanding to foster those principles which, for the purpose of extending mercy, undeserved, to the murderer, would heap gross injustice and cruelty upon the whole community, to break down the positive law of God, which Jesus Christ declared that he came to confirm, and in its place and stead to erect the sickly decrees of a society of philandering puppets, whose wires are notoriously pulled by certain professional and political managers. I might stop here to comment that Islam allows guardianship but not adoption. You know, it's not your new family. In the commencement of my remarks upon this romance of real life, I endeavored to forfend against the suspicion of undervaluing that species of evidence which is called presumptive or circumstantial. It is accounted by the most able writers on this branch of jurisprudence of the highest quality. Thus, in his admirable work on Evidence, Volume 1, Section 13, Professor Greenleaf remarks that in both civil and criminal cases, a verdict may well be founded on circumstances alone, and these often lead to a conclusion far more satisfactory than direct evidence can produce. The errors committed by the judges upon the trial of the Byrnes, and those errors were egregious, were twofold: the admission of extrajudicial confessions, manifestly extorted by hope and fear, and suffering a conviction to take place before the dead body of the person alleged to have been murdered had been discovered. The rule on the subject of confessions is sufficiently plain. Deliberate confessions of guilt, says Mr. Greenleaf, same source, section 215, are among the most effectual proofs in the law, but they should be received and weighed with caution. For as he remarks in section 214, it should be recollected that the mind of the prisoner himself is oppressed by the calamity of his situation, and that he is often influenced by motives of hope or fear to make an untrue confession. Mr. Greenleaf then proceeds to say, in a note on this passage, of this character was the remarkable case of the two Byrnes, and so on, and proceeds to give a summary of the case. In the United States, says Mr. Greenleaf, same source, section 217, the prisoner's confession, when the corpus delicti is not otherwise proved, has been held insufficient for his conviction, and this opinion certainly best accords with the humanity of the criminal code and with a great degree of caution applied in receiving and weighing the evidence of confessions and other cases, and it seems countenanced by approved writers on this branch of the law. Again, same source, section 219, he remarks, before any confession can be received in evidence in a criminal case, it must be shown that it was voluntary, some words left out. A free and voluntary confession, says IRCB, is deserving of the highest credit because it is presumed to flow from the strongest sense of guilt, and therefore it is admitted as proof of the crime to which it refers. But a confession forced from the mind by the flattery of hope or by the torture of fear comes in so questionable a shape when it is to be considered as the evidence of guilt that no credit ought to be given to it, and therefore it is rejected. Unfortunately, Judges Chase and Doolittle thought otherwise, and brought themselves and the condemned upon the very threshold of a terrible catastrophe. Mr. Greenleaf, in the note above referred to, alludes to an article in the North American Review, Volume 10, page 418, in which this case of the Burns is examined. It was from the pen of a gentleman whose high professional prospects were blasted by an early death. This writer had seen nothing, however, but a very imperfect report of the trial. His article was published in April 1820, about 4 months after the discovery of Colvin. The conclusions at which he arrives, that the confessions ought not to have been admitted, would have gained additional strength had he inspected the certified minutes taken on the trial by the Chief Justice. Had he seen those certified minutes of the evidence, he would scarcely have described the utter inconsistency of the two confessions by the inadequate phrase. There are differences between them, for Stephen's claims the whole act of killing to himself, while Jesse's charges the father, who was notoriously not present, with cutting Colvin's throat while he was yet living, and after Stephen had given him a blow. This writer relies strongly upon the humane caution of Sir Matthew Hale, to which I have alluded, that no conviction in case of murder or manslaughter should ever take place till the fact were proven, or the dead body had been discovered. A perfect horror of induction seems to have settled down like a dense cloud upon the southwestern corner of Vermont. Judges and jurymen appear to have been stupefied by its power. The important consequence, vital to the whole, they assume to be true without trial or experiment. I have looked attentively into every document that I could lay my hands upon connected with this subject, and I cannot discover that any effort whatever was made by anyone till after the trial to discover the living body of Colvin. The interesting ramble of Jesse and Judge Skinner upon the mountain was in search of Colvin's dead body, but upon the publication of the notice in the Rutland Herald, November 26, 1819, stating the facts and calling for information in regard to Colvin, and a similar notice of the same date in the New York Evening Post in 10 days, that is December 6th, the most ample and satisfactory information was published by Mr. Tabor Chadwick in regard to the living body of Russell Colvin. The great caution of Sir Matthew Hale was meant not less for the prisoner than for the whole community, no one of whom can be sure through a long life of escaping from the oppressive influence of circumstances, accidentally or purposely, combined against him. His discreet humanity spread no mantle of imitation, charity, or morbid philanthropy over the guilty. He was a bold practitioner, too bold by far, occasionally, as in the case of Calendar and Dunny, but this great good man well knew that prisoners charged with murder were entitled to all the benefit of reasonable doubt. He well knew that no judicial caution could go further to save than the fierce suspicion of an excited community would go to destroy. He well knew that with not a small number, the very enormity of the crime seems to supply the want of legal evidence, and that in many cases to be suspected is to be condemned. We have all heard of the jury who, having convicted a prisoner of murder in direct opposition to the judge's instructions, and being questioned and reproved, replied that an enormous crime had been committed and ought to be atoned for, and they saw no good reason why the prisoner, the only person suspected, should not be selected as the victim. Sir Matthew Hale's forbearance extended to the cases of reprieve after conviction before another judge. Thus, in HPC, Volume 2, Chapter 56, he says, I have generally observed this rule, that I would never give judgment or award execution upon a person reprieved by any other judge but myself, because I could not know upon what ground or reason he reprieved him. Upon this, there is the following pertinent note. The usefulness of this caution may be seen from what is observed by Sir John Howells in his remarks on Cornish's trial, where he relates the case of some persons who had been convicted of the murder of a person absent, barely by inferences from foolish words and actions, but the judge before whom it was tried was so unsatisfied in the matter, because the body of the person supposed to be murdered was not to be found, that he reprieved the persons condemned. Yet, in a circuit afterwards, a certain unwary judge, without inquiring into the reasons of the reprieve, ordered execution, and the persons to be hanged in chains, which was done accordingly, and afterwards, to his reproach, the persons supposed to be murdered appeared alive. The death of the person alleged to have been murdered is manifestly not less a constituent part of the crime than the malus prepense, or the employment of the means. These three things are necessary to constitute murder in the eye of the law. Thus, an acquittal has taken place where the murder was alleged to have been committed on the high seas, and the malice and the blow only were proved to have occurred on the high seas, and the death in the harbor of Cape Francois. Such was the case of the U.S. against Mr. Gill, reported in Dallas. This extreme particularity appears to some persons exceedingly ridiculous, but not quite as much so as certain commentaries upon legal proceedings which we sometimes meet with in the ordinary journals of the day. Aaron Burr, whom I desire not to quote too frequently, once shrewdly remarked, "He who despises forms knows not what he despises. To infer the death from the malice and the employment of the means in all cases would be absurd. If one man maliciously knocks another into the sea, here is certainly a violent assault and battery, perhaps an assault with intent to kill. But before we join in the popular Hutesium et clamor, we have two important points to settle beyond all reasonable doubt. First, if the person knocked overboard be dead, for if he may have swum to land or have been picked up at sea alive, in which case, unless he die of the blow within the time prescribed, there can be neither murder nor manslaughter. Now, menacing that results in a person's death, I would say that that should be counted too, right? Just like, this stuff with the war. Like, one president of the United States during his 8 years had up to 65 million people fleeing his war actions at a time, and millions actually died from that. Certainly he and the other people that made that decision should have been held accountable, right? And secondly, if he be proved to have died of the injury within that time, we must duly weigh the previous circumstances and the provocation to ascertain if the act done be manslaughter or murder. Those who vociferate most loudly against the law for its hesitancy and demand the immediate descent of the executioner's axe upon the neck of the victim will be the very first fervently to supplicate for the law's most merciful carefulness of life. Should a father, a brother, or a son be charged with a crime and involved in the complicated meshes of presumptive evidence,